There's a specific kind of silence that follows a business failure. Not the loud kind of silence. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind. The kind that settles in slowly over weeks while you are still pretending to yourself that something might turn around. While you are still checking numbers that have stopped moving. While you're still showing up to something that has already ended. You just haven't said it out loud yet. I know that silence well. I lived inside it for longer than I should have. And when it finally broke, when I finally sat down and looked at the full damage clearly, what I saw was this. No savings, real debt, a reputation that felt fragile in a way it had never felt before. In a period of my life, I had given everything to, with nothing left to show for it. I was 31 years old. I sat with that for one evening. Then I got up, made coffee, and started thinking about what came next. What came next was 2 jobs, a debt I paid off dollar by dollar, and a second venture I built in the hours nobody could see. What came after that is why I'm telling this story. To understand where it ended up, you need to know exactly where it started. I want to tell you about the person I was before the failure. Not to make you like me, not to set up a contrast, but because I think it matters, the specific kind of belief you carry into your first business. The texture of it, where it comes from, and what it costs you when it breaks. I grew up in a household where work was the answer to everything. Not wealth, work. There is a difference. My family was not poor, but we were never far enough from difficulty that anyone relaxed about it. Money was something you were careful with, something you respected, something you did not waste on things that weren't certain. I absorbed that deeply. It became the operating system underneath everything I did. I was disciplined from early on. Saved money from the first job I ever had, a part-time thing at 16 that paid very little but felt important because it was mine. I didn't spend freely. I didn't borrow. I built small habits of financial care that compounded quietly over the years. By my late 20s, I had something real to show for it. Not a lot by some people's standards, but by mine. Savings I had built from scratch, no debt, a clean financial foundation that had taken years of consistent, unglamorous effort to construct. I was proud of it, and I was ready to use it. The business idea had been developing for a couple of years before I acted on it. I won't go into the specifics of what it was. That's not the point of this story, and the details don't change what happened. What matters is that it was real, thought through, not a fantasy or an impulse. I had researched it. I had looked at the market carefully. I had talked to people who knew the space and taken their feedback seriously. I believed in it. That word, believed, I wanted to hold on to it. Because the belief was genuine. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't naivety exactly. It was the specific confidence of someone who has been careful and disciplined their whole life, finally deciding that the moment is right and the preparation is sufficient. I quit my job on a Friday. I remember that day clearly. The conversation with my manager, a decent man who wished me well and meant it. The drive home. The feeling of the car being somehow lighter than usual. The particular quality of that evening. Dinner with my partner. A bottle of wine we had been saving. The conversation that stayed up later than we planned because everything felt open and possible. I didn't sleep much that night. Not from anxiety. From energy. The forward-leaning energy of someone at the beginning of something they have chosen completely. I started the following Monday. The first months were everything I'd hoped they would be. Not easy. I want to be accurate about that. It was hard work from the first day. Long hours, constant decisions, the particular exhaustion of a business in its early stage where everything requires your direct attention because there's nobody else. But it was the good kind of hard. The kind that feels like progress, even when it's uncomfortable. I had a small circle of people around me during that period. Friends who were excited about what I was building. Former colleagues who offered advice and connections. A few people who came closer specifically because something new and energetic was happening. That particular gravity that early-stage ventures have, where the possibility of the thing draws people toward it. I noticed who those people were. I didn't think much about it at the time. I was too focused on the work. Looking back, I can see the dynamic clearly. Some of those people were genuinely invested in me. They asked the real questions. They pushed back when something didn't make sense. They were honest in the way that cost something. Those people were rare, and I didn't fully appreciate how rare at the time. Others were invested in the energy, in the proximity to something that might become something, in the version of me that was ascending, confident, building, moving forward. I couldn't tell the difference yet. The business ran for almost 2 years. The first year was genuinely promising. Revenue came in. Not enough, never quite enough, but enough to feel like validation. Enough to tell myself the model was working and that scale would solve the gap between what was coming in and what was going out. Scale didn't come, not for lack of effort. I worked harder in that second year than I have ever worked in my life. I made adjustments. I pivoted where pivoting made sense. I cut costs. I had the difficult conversations with myself at 2 in the morning that every person running a business eventually has. The honest ones where you look at the numbers without the story around them and just see what they are. The numbers were telling me something I didn't want to hear. I kept going anyway. That is the part one looked back on with the most complexity. The months of continuing past the point where the honest answer was already visible. Not out of stupidity, out of the particular stubbornness of someone who has bet everything and cannot yet bring themselves to call it. There is a cost to those extra months. Not just financial, though the financial cost was real, but the internal cost of sustaining belief in something your instincts have already quietly given up on. That kind of effort leaves a mark. One morning, I sat down with everything in front of me. Every number, every projection, every realistic scenario I could construct. And I let myself see it clearly. It was over. Not dramatically. Not with a single catastrophic event. Just the slow, accumulated mathematics of a business that had never found the footing it needed, and now had no runway left to keep looking. I closed the laptop. I sat in the quiet for a while, and then I started to understand what the damage actually looked like. The damage had a number attached to it. I'm not going to tell you the exact figure. Not because I'm ashamed of it. I made peace with the shame a long time ago. But because the number is not the point. The point is what a number like that feels like when you have spent your entire adult life being careful. When financial discipline is not just a habit, but a core part of how you understand yourself. It felt like a contradiction of everything I believed about who I was. That was the hardest part. Not the debt itself. Debt can be paid. But the gap between the person I thought I was and the situation I was now in. The distance between the careful, disciplined, prepared version of myself and a man sitting at a desk with no savings, real obligations, and nothing left in the account he had spent years building. I gave myself that day, one full day to sit with it, to feel the full weight of it without trying to manage it or reframe it or find the lesson in it, just to let it be as bad as it was. The next morning I got up at my usual time, made coffee, sat at the table, and I started making a list, not of what I had lost, of what I needed to do. Debt first. I wrote down every obligation clearly, the full picture, nothing hidden from myself, every number in the light. That process was uncomfortable in the specific way that honesty is uncomfortable when you have been avoiding the full version of something. Then I wrote down what I needed to earn to address it. Monthly, weekly, daily. Then I wrote down how I was going to earn it. 2 jobs, not glamorous ones. Not jobs in my field or at my level or with any particular relationship to where I had been or where I intended to go. Just work, income, the practical machinery of digging out. I found the first one within a week, the second shortly after. I'm not going to tell you it was fine. It wasn't fine. There is nothing comfortable about working 2 jobs when you are in your early 30s and you have run your own business and you have a clear picture of what you are capable of. Every shift carried a small weight that had nothing to do with the work itself and everything to do with the distance between where I was and where I had been. I carried that weight quietly. I didn't put on anyone else. I showed up. I did the work. I was professional in both roles regardless of how I felt about being in them. That discipline, the same one that had built the savings I had lost, was still there, unbroken. That mattered more than I can explain. What I had not fully prepared for was the people. The business failing had a social dimension I hadn't anticipated. Not because I was naive exactly. I understood intellectually that failure changes how people treat you. But understanding something intellectually and experiencing it are different things. The disappearances happened first. Gradual, quiet, the way the tide goes out. You don't notice the moment it turns, only that at some point the water is much further away than it was. People who had been regularly present during the building phase became suddenly, gently unavailable. Messages that previously would have been answered quickly now took days. Invitations that used to come stopped coming. The particular warmth that had existed in certain friendships, warmth I now understood had been partly fueled by proximity to something ascending, cooled without anyone saying anything about it. Nobody announced they were leaving. They just left, in the quiet, deniable way that people leave when they want to avoid the discomfort of an honest conversation about why. I noticed every single one. I want to be clear, I didn't chase any of them. I didn't send a message asking what had changed or why the energy had shifted. I just noted it, filed it, and kept moving. The comments were harder than the disappearances. Disappearances are passive. They don't require anything from you. The comments require me to sit still and absorb something while keeping my face neutral. Some were disguised as concern. The friend who said he had always worried the business model wasn't sustainable, which was interesting because he had never said that while it was running. The relative who talked about the importance of security and steady employment in a tone that was meant to sound wise and landed as something else entirely. Some are less disguised. A person I had known for years, someone I considered a genuine friend, made a joke at my expense in front of other people. About the failure. About the jobs I was now working. Light enough to be deniable. Sharp enough that everyone in the room understood exactly what it was. I smiled, said nothing, drove home that night, and sat with the specific feeling of being mocked by someone you trusted. It is a particular kind of hurt. Not the loudest kind, but one of the more lasting ones. I did not confront him. I did not send a message that night or any night after. I just updated my understanding of who he was and moved on. What I held on to, what kept the whole period from becoming something darker than it was, were the people who stayed. There weren't many. I want to be honest about that. The number of people who showed up consistently during the worst of it was small enough that I could count them without running out of fingers. They didn't make speeches about it. They didn't perform their loyalty. They just kept showing up. A message checking in. A coffee that happened without any agenda. Presence that didn't require me to be anything other than where I was. One friend in particular, a man named Daniel, called me every week during that period. Not to discuss the failure or to offer advice or to tell me what I should have done differently. Just to talk about ordinary things. About his life, my life, the world in general. Normal conversation that treated me like a normal person rather than a cautionary tale. I never told Daniel what that meant to me. I didn't need to. He wasn't doing it for acknowledgement. Those people, the small number of them, became the fixed points of that period. The proof that the ground was still there even when everything else felt uncertain. I kept working. I kept paying down the debt. I kept showing up to both jobs with the same professionalism I would have brought to anything. And at night, after the shifts, on weekends, and whatever hours were left, I started doing something I hadn't told anyone about. I started building again. I want to explain why I told nobody. It wasn't strategy exactly. It wasn't that I sat down and calculated that secrecy would serve me better than transparency. It was something more instinctive than that. The first time I had built something, I had talked about it. Openly. With energy and detail and the natural enthusiasm of someone who believes in what they are doing. I had let people into the process early. I had shared the vision before the vision had any evidence behind it. And I had learned, not bitterly, just clearly, that sharing a thing before it exists gives people the opportunity to have opinions about it that cost them nothing. Anyone can assess a plan. Anyone can identify risks in something that hasn't been tested yet. Anyone can look at an idea and tell you why it might not work. I didn't want opinions. I didn't want assessment. I didn't want encouragement either. Encouragement that costs nothing is worth roughly the same. I just wanted to build. So I built in silence. The hours were strange during that period. I was working 2 jobs, which meant my days were spoken for almost entirely. The time I had was the time that falls through the cracks of full schedule. Early mornings before the first shift. Late evenings after the second. Weekend hours that most people spend recovering. I used every one of them. I was tired in a way that became normal. The kind of tiredness that stops feeling like a temporary condition and starts feeling like just the texture of your life. I adapted to it, learned to work inside it rather than waiting for it to lift. The new venture was different from the first one in every way that mattered. Smaller in scope. Deliberately. I had learned the specific danger of building for what something could become before you have proven what it currently is. The first business had been designed for scale before it had earned the right to scale. That was one of several things I understood now that I hadn't fully understood before. I built this one for what it was. A service I could deliver well to a specific type of client with a clear and honest value proposition. Nothing ambitious in its framing. Just something real that solved a real problem for people who had that problem. The first failure had been an expensive education. I was going to use everything it had taught me. I worked on it in a notebook first. Not a business plan exactly, more like a running conversation with myself. Questions I needed to answer. Assumptions I needed to test. Things I thought I knew that I forced myself to verify rather than accept. That process took longer than the impatient part of me wanted it to take. I let it take as long as it needed. When I moved from the notebook to actual work, first clients, first conversations, first real tests of whether the thing held up outside my own head, I did it without any announcement. No launch, no post, no moment of telling people something new was beginning. I just started. The first client came through a direct conversation. Someone I had worked with years before the first business. A professional contact who had always respected my work and who had a specific problem I knew I could solve. I reached out simply, explained what I was doing, asked if it was relevant to him. It was. We worked together for 6 weeks. I delivered well. He paid on time and said he would use me again. I went back to my notebook, updated what I had learned, found the next conversation. That was the rhythm of it for the first several months. No momentum yet, just accumulation. The quiet, invisible kind of progress that doesn't feel like progress when you're inside it, because each individual step is too small to celebrate. You just take the next one and trust that they are adding up to something. Meanwhile, the debt was moving. Slowly, every month a portion of it gone. The number reducing in increments that felt insignificant individually, but were building towards something real. I tracked it carefully, not obsessively. I didn't need to look at it every day, but I kept the picture accurate. I knew exactly where I stood at any given point. There is something grounding about that, about refusing to look away from the hard number and instead watching it change. It takes the fear out of it. The thing you track loses its power to ambush you. The 2 jobs continued through most of that first year of building. I want to sit in that period for a moment, because I think it is the part of this story that deserves the most honesty. It was hard, not in a way I couldn't manage, but genuinely, unglamorously hard. There were mornings I woke up tired before the day had started. Evenings where I sat down to work on the new venture and had to find energy that didn't feel like it was there. Moments of sitting in the break room of one of the jobs and having a quiet conversation with myself about whether any of this was going to amount to anything. Those conversations could have gone either way. They went the way I needed them to go because of something simple. I'd already done the hardest thing. I'd already lost everything and gotten back up. The question of whether I could endure the current difficulty had an answer, and the answer was yes, obviously, because I was already doing it. That sounds straightforward, but in the middle of a hard stretch at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, it is the most useful thing you can tell yourself. You have already done the hardest thing. This is not the hardest thing. Toward the end of that first year, something started to shift. The new venture had clients now. Not many, but consistent ones. People who came back. People who mentioned me to other people. The specific organic movement of work that is good enough to travel on its own. I dropped on the 2 jobs. That felt like something. I don't want to overstate it. I was still working long hours, and the financial picture was still more constrained than I wanted it to be. But letting go of one of the 2 jobs was a marker. A real one. The first concrete sign that the direction of travel had changed. I let myself feel that for one evening. Then I went back to work. The debt cleared completely on a Thursday afternoon. I transferred the final payment from my account. Sat back, looked at the screen for a moment. 0. I had rebuilt from 0 before. I could do it again from here. Well, I didn't know yet. What I had no way of seeing from where I was sitting on that Thursday afternoon was that the calls were about to start. And when they did, I would find out exactly what the last 2 years had taught me about people. The first call came from someone I hadn't spoken to in almost 18 months. His name was Marcus. We had been close during the early days of the first business, the kind of close that forms quickly around shared energy and mutual ambition. He had been one of the people who had drifted, not dramatically, just steadily, quietly, until the call stopped and the messages went unanswered and I stopped reaching out because I had understood by then what the silence meant. He called on a Tuesday evening. Casual opener. How are things? How have you been? The easy warmth of someone who has decided the gap in contact is not worth acknowledging directly. I was polite. I answered the surface questions. I kept my voice even. Then he said he had heard things were going well. That word had gotten around. That he had been thinking about me and wanted to reconnect. I said it was good to hear from him. We talked for 20 minutes. He asked questions about the new venture, specific ones, the kind that told me he had already done some asking around before picking up the phone. He said it sounded impressive. Said he always knew I had it in me. That phrase. I always knew I had it in me. I let it pass without comment. Just noted it. Filed it next to everything else I had filed about Marcus over the previous 18 months. We said we would catch up properly soon. He said, definitely. I said, of course. I hung up and sat with the call for a moment. Not with anger. Something quieter than anger. The specific clarity of seeing a dynamic completely. Understanding exactly what it is and what it isn't, and feeling neither surprised nor particularly moved by it. Marcus had left when things were hard. Marcus had returned when things were good. That was the whole story. Everything else was detail. More calls followed over the next few weeks. Each one followed a pattern similar enough that I started to recognize it before the real purpose of the call revealed itself. The casual opener, the catching up, the warmth that arrived fully formed without any acknowledgement of the absence that preceded it. And then, at some point in the conversation, the pivot, the reason the call had actually been made. Sometimes it was an opportunity they wanted to discuss, a collaboration, a partnership, some version of involvement in what I was building now that it appeared to be worth involving yourself in. Sometimes it was advice. Could they pick my brain? Could they get my read on something? Could they have an hour of the expertise I had developed, partly, though nobody said this directly, through the failure they had watched from comfortable distance? Sometimes it was more direct than that. One person, someone who had made a comment at my expense in front of others during the worst period, called and asked, with almost no preamble, whether I was in a position to invest in something he was working on. I told him I wasn't. He seemed surprised, as if the gap between who I had been at my lowest point and who I appear to be now was so large that the previous version of me was simply gone. As if the person who had sat in that room and absorbed his joke was a different person entirely, and this new version had no memory of it. I did not remind him. I just told him I wasn't in a position to help and wished him well with it. He was polite about it. So was I. That was the last time we spoke. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters for anyone listening who has been through something similar. I did not handle all of these calls with perfect equanimity. There were moments, private ones, where the accumulation of it landed heavily. where the contrast between who had been there in the hard months and who was suddenly available now that the hard months were over felt sharp in a way I had to sit with quietly before it passed. The person who found it hardest to extend basic grace to was someone I had considered a close friend. Not Marcus, someone else. Someone who had been present enough during the failure to have witnessed it properly, who had said the kind of things that people say when they want to feel superior while appearing sympathetic, and who now called with the easy warmth of someone who had simply moved past it. He wanted to meet for dinner, talk about old times, see what I was working on. I agreed to the dinner. I sat across from him for 2 hours. I was cordial. I asked about his life. I listened to his stories. I answered his questions about the business without giving him anything real. At the end of the evening, he said it was great to catch up, said we should do it more often, said he had missed this. I said I was glad we had done it. I drove home, and I knew clearly that I would not be doing it again. Not out of cruelty, just out of accuracy. Some relationships have a shelf life, and when that life is over, the honest thing is to let them be over quietly rather than maintaining a version of them that no longer has any substance. I was done maintaining things that had no substance. Through all of this, the calls, the dinners, the reconnections of varying degrees of transparency, I kept one thing constant. I never brought up the past. Not once. Not to any of them. No reference to the silence during the hard period. No mention of the comments. No moment of making someone sit with what they had done or said or failed to do. I just treated each person with basic courtesy and gave them access to exactly the version of me they had earned through how they had behaved when it cost them something to be present. The people who had stayed, Daniel, and the small number of others, I gave everything to. My time, my honesty, my genuine presence. When opportunities arose that I could direct toward them, I directed them without hesitation and without making a performance of it. The others got courtesy. Nothing more. Nothing less. Nobody received an explanation for the difference. Nobody asked for one directly. I think most of them understood it without needing it stated. And quietly, without any announcement, I was becoming more settled about all of it. Because the venture was growing now in a way that was starting to feel like something I could no longer easily ignore. And what it was becoming was bigger than anything I had originally allowed myself to plan for. Growth in a small business is not cinematic. Nobody tells you that enough. There's no moment where the graph suddenly turns upward and stays there and everyone in the room sees it happen at the same time. It is messier than that. More gradual, more ambiguous in the middle of it than it looks from the outside afterward. What actually happens is this. You do good work for one client. That client mentions you to someone. That someone calls. You do good work for them too. They mention you to someone else. The chain builds slowly and without fanfare, and for a long time you're not sure if it is building into something real or just a run of good fortune that will level off. You keep working either way. That had been my approach from the beginning, and it didn't change as things started moving faster. If anything, I became more focused as the momentum built, more deliberate about quality, more careful about which clients I took on, more attentive to the details that separate work that is good from work that is genuinely excellent. I had learned from the first business that growth without a solid foundation is just a faster way to fail. I was not going to make that mistake again. The clients I was working with by the second year were meaningfully larger than the ones I'd started with. Not because I'd chased size, I hadn't. Because good work at one level tends to get referred upward. The person you help well tells someone above them. That person has bigger problems and more budget, and if the work holds up at that level, the referral chain keeps climbing. It held up. I expanded carefully, brought in help when the work genuinely required it. Not to look larger than I was, but because there were hours in the week I simply couldn't cover alone, and I refused to let quality slip because I was stretched too thin. The people I brought in were chosen carefully. I hired from my actual network, not the network that had reformed itself around my success, but the original one. The people who had been present during the hard period. Daniel's recommendation led me to the first person I brought on properly. Someone steady and skilled, and without any of the ego that makes early hires complicated. That hire was one of the best decisions I made in the second year. We worked well together. The same values around quality and honesty and doing things properly even when nobody was watching. I didn't have to manage him in the anxious way you manage someone whose standards you're not sure of. I just gave him work, and he delivered it, and we trusted each other. That trust, the simple, functional trust of two people who know each other's character, was something I had come to value above almost any other professional quality. You cannot build anything real without it. The financial picture during this period was almost disorienting in its contrast to where I had been 2 years earlier. The debt was gone. The savings were rebuilding. The monthly numbers were consistently in a direction that 2 years earlier I would have found difficult to imagine from where I was sitting. I tracked it with the same discipline I had tracked the debt. The same careful attention to the real numbers without the story around them. The habit didn't change because the picture had improved. If anything, I was more rigorous about it now. Because I understood in a way I hadn't before the first failure exactly how quickly a financial position can move in the wrong direction when you stop paying close attention. I was paying close attention. I also started doing something I hadn't done during the first business. I started writing things down. Not the financials. I had always done that. I mean the other things. The decisions I was making and why. The instincts I was following and the ones I was overriding. The lessons from the first failure that were actively informing how I was building this one. The mistakes I was catching early because I had already made them in a more expensive context. I kept a running document. Not for anyone else, just for me. A record of the thinking behind the building. I don't know exactly why I started doing it. Something about the second attempt felt more conscious than the first. More awake, like I was building with both eyes open this time instead of one eye on the vision and one eye closed against the possibility of failure. The document became something I returned to regularly. Not to congratulate myself, to check myself. To make sure the decisions I was making today were consistent with the things I had learned at the highest possible cost. They mostly were. And when they weren't, when I caught myself moving too fast or assuming too much or letting enthusiasm outrun evidence, the document was there to slow me down. I owed that discipline to the person I had been in those hard months, to the version of me that had worked 2 jobs and built in the cracks of a full schedule and kept going without telling anyone. That version of me had earned the business I was now running. The least I could do was run it in a way that honored what it had cost to build. The calls from the people who had returned were still coming occasionally. Less frequent now. I think some of them had taken to measure the distance I was maintaining and understood that the easy warmth of their reappearance was not going to be matched. Not with coldness, I was never cold, but with the kind of pleasant, impenetrable professionalism that left no opening for the depth of connection they seemed to be reaching for. That was fine with me. I had the connections that mattered. The small, real ones that had been tested and had held. I didn't need the other kind. I had tried the other kind and understood its value precisely. There was one moment during that second year that I want to tell you about. Not a big moment. A quiet one. Daniel and I were having coffee. One of our regular ones, the kind that had continued unchanged through the failure and the 2 jobs and all of it. We were talking about the business. About where it was going, about the plans I had for the next 12 months. At some point he said, "You seem different." I asked what he meant. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "Settled. You seem settled." I sat with that word. Settled. Not successful, though things were going well. Not happy, though I was genuinely. Settled, like someone who has found the ground under their feet and is no longer expending energy wondering whether it will hold. That was accurate. I had been through the thing I was most afraid of. I had lost everything and kept going and built something real from nothing for the second time. The fear that had lived underneath the first business. The low-level anxiety of someone who has never tested their own resilience was simply gone. I knew now what I could do. Not in an arrogant way. in the grounded way of someone who has evidence. And what was coming next was going to be the clearest evidence of all. The second year ended quietly. No milestone moment. No single day where I looked up and thought, there, that's when it changed. Just the steady accumulation of good work compounding into something I could no longer describe as small. The business was real now. Not in the way the first one had felt real. The feeling real of belief and momentum and possibility. Real in a harder, more durable sense. Clients who had been with me for over a year. Revenue that was consistent rather than hopeful. A reputation in the industry that had been built entirely through the work itself and not through any announcement or positioning or deliberate effort to be seen. I had not posted about the journey. I had not written about the comeback. I had not shared the 2 jobs or the debt or the nights of building in whatever hours were left. None of it had been public. I had just worked, and the work had traveled on its own. That was the thing I kept coming back to during that period. The way results move through an industry when they are genuine. Not quickly, never quickly, but steadily and in a direction that doesn't reverse. Each good outcome becoming a reference point for the next conversation. Each satisfied client becoming a quiet advocate who mentions your name in rooms you never enter. You cannot manufacture that. You can only earn it and then get out of its way. By the 3rd year, I had a team. Small. I kept it intentionally small. For people including myself. Each one chosen carefully. Each one someone whose work I had seen up close before I brought them in. No hiring based on potential or personality or the confident energy of a good interview. Only hiring based on demonstrated quality in actual work. That discipline cost me time. There were periods where we were stretched, and the easier thing would have been to bring someone in quickly and hope for the best. I didn't do it because I had learned at significant cost that the culture of a small team is set by every single person in it. One person who cuts corners quietly changes what corners mean. One person who treats quality as optional changes what optional means. The standards you protect in the lean periods are the standards that survive into the growth periods. I protected them. The team that resulted was something I was genuinely proud of. Not loud about it. Pride in a team is something you feel internally and express through how you treat them, but proud in the real sense. The sense of having built something with people whose work and character you respect completely. Daniel joined the team in the 3rd year. That felt right in a way I didn't need to analyze. He had been there through everything, not as a witness, just as a constant. The steady presence of someone who shows up regardless of the weather. Bringing him into the work felt like the most natural extension of what he had already been. He was good at it. Of course he was. I told him once, quietly, without making it a moment, that I remembered every week he had called during the hard period, that I hadn't forgotten it and never would. He said something like, "That's what you do," which is exactly the kind of thing Daniel would say. The clients from the first business came back over time. Not all of them, not dramatically. Just gradually, one by one, the professional relationships that had existed before the failure, finding their way back through the industry to wherever I now was. Some of them had heard about the new venture through the natural channels of a connected industry. Some had been referred by mutual contacts. Some had simply reached out directly, a straightforward message saying they had heard good things and wanted to have a conversation. I took every one of those conversations, not out of any desire to demonstrate something, just because they were professional relationships that had been genuine and were worth maintaining. The failure of the first business had been mine. It had nothing to do with how those clients had been treated or what the work had delivered while it was running. They had no obligation to return, and the fact that some of them did was something I received with simple gratitude. One of those conversations stayed with me. A client from the early days of the first business, a woman named Caroline, who had been one of the first people to take a chance on me when I was still establishing credibility. She had watched the first business from a close enough distance to have seen the whole arc. The hope of the beginning, the struggle of the middle, the end. She called about 3 years after everything had collapsed. We talked for a long time. Properly. The kind of conversation that covers real ground rather than staying on the surface. At some point, she said, "I want to tell you something." I waited. She said she had almost called during the hard period, that she had thought about it more than once. But she hadn't known what to say, and she hadn't wanted to make it worse, and so she had stayed silent. She said she had thought about that silence since, and it had bothered her. I told her she didn't need to carry that. She said, "I know, but I wanted you to know I thought about it." That mattered to me, not because it changed anything, it didn't, but because it was honest, because it acknowledged something real without dressing it up in comfortable language. She hadn't called. She knew she hadn't called. And instead of pretending the gap hadn't existed or filling it with manufactured warmth, she had just said the plain true thing. That kind of honesty is rare. I respected her for it then, and I respect her for it now. She became one of my most valued long-term clients. The people who had left and returned with casual warmth, the Marcuses of the situation, remained at the edge of my professional life where they had placed themselves through their own choices. I treated them with consistent courtesy whenever our paths crossed. I wished them well in the genuine but distant way you wish well to people you have released any real expectation of. Some of them did well. Some of them didn't. I followed neither outcome closely. What they had done during the hard period was not something I held against them in any active sense. Holding things against people requires ongoing energy, and I had better uses for mine. But it had informed my understanding of who they were. And that understanding shaped what I offered them going forward, which was basic decency and nothing more. Nobody received a conversation about it. Nobody received an explanation of why the closeness that had once existed no longer existed. They received exactly the treatment their behavior had indicated they valued. Presence when things were going well, and nothing more personal than that. That felt like the right proportion. I think about the failure sometimes. Less often now than I used to. But it hasn't disappeared, and I don't think it should. It is part of the architecture of everything I have built since. Not as a wound, but as a foundation. The specific kind of foundation that only gets laid through losing something completely and then having to decide what to do next. I made the right decision. Not the heroic version of the right decision. The quiet, ordinary, one foot in front of the other version. I got up. I took the jobs. I paid the debt. I built in the hours nobody could see. I kept going without telling anyone I was keeping going. That's the whole story. There is no more dramatic version of it. And the people in my life now, the team, the clients, the small number of genuine friendships that survived the fire of a hard period, they're all people I know in the deepest possible way. Because I know what they did when staying cost them something. That knowledge is worth more than anything the business has generated. Worth more than the revenue, the reputation, the recovery of everything I lost, and then some. You learn almost nothing about people when things are going well. You learn everything when they're not. If you have ever lost something you built and wondered whether getting back up was worth it, I hope this answered that question. Leave a comment below. Tell me where you are in your own story. I read everyone. And if you want to hear what comes next, the next story is already waiting for you.